All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Stooks. I serve as the coordinator of college access and student success at Wofford College, and I'm also serve as a member of Wofford College's 2021 Virtual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Committee. As a committee, Wofford College, we have a social responsibility to acknowledge the historical context
Hello now.
in which Wofford currently exists. As a result, we acknowledge that we gather as an institution of higher learning on ancestral lands of indigenous people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and thank enrolled members of the Cherokee Nation and their tribes for their involvement in helping the college learn more about the people who are stewards of the land Wofford currently occupies. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans who labored to lay the physical foundation of the college. As a result, this committee commits to actively engaging and learning about the history of the lands we occupy, how to be better stewards of it, and to continue to honor with intention and respect the historical and current significance of indigenous and enslaved peoples who have suffered in the creation of the college and who are credited for its current existence. So once again, thank you all for joining us for today's session. This year's theme for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Week is keeping the same energy. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. A special thanks goes to Dean Taifa Alexander for her leadership in this year's MLK celebration and for providing the draft for this script. We are honored to have with us Mr. Marquis Clarke, um, who is a well-respected member of the Spartanburg community as he discusses the intersections of education, politics, and social justice as it relates to the current commission. The flow of this afternoon's discussion will begin with a brief introduction of Marquis Clarke, followed by a presentation by Mr. Clarke himself. As the presentation concludes, questions from the participants will be asked if time permits. All attendees, if you have questions, please submit those questions to me privately using the chat feature. I will make every effort to answer those questions as possible. However, we may not be able to get to every question. And as a final logistical note, in order to have a productive conversation and presentation, any attendee who is engaging in disrespectful, harassing, or racist behavior will be removed from the session. All right, at this time, I will now introduce Mr. Marquis Clarke. And this is definitely a highlight for me. I've been looking forward to this session all week. I'm glad that he is with us today. He is the son of Reverend James and Alethea Clarke, and is the youngest of four boys. Marquis Clarke was educated in the public schools of Sumter County, South Carolina. He has completed continuing education courses at USC Upstate and holds a bachelor's degree in elementary education with a minor in history from Morris College. He also holds a Master of Arts degree and an Education Specialist degree in Administration and Supervision from Furman University and plans to complete his doctorate in education in 2021. With a never-ending passion for service, while a student at Lakewood High School, Marquis served as student body president. He represented his school at as a Boy State delegate. He also received the Citizenship Award and was elected to Who's Who among high school students for his effort to feed Sumter County's less fortunate families. Mr. Clarke organized his classmates to donate over 1,000 non-perishable food items. While attending Morris College, Marquis Clarke was actively involved in participating in and graduating from the nationally recognized Call Me Mr. program. During his tenure at Morris College, Marquis Clarke is he was mostly proud for establishing the Catalyst Award, which was created to pay the licensure examination fee, which is also known as the praxis, for any student in financial hardship. Other notable accomplishments include being recently appointed to the Strive Together Strategic Planning Advisory Committee. In 2017, he was appointed to the Strive Together Accelerated Leadership Program. awarded the James Clyburn Political Fellowship, and received the Call Me Mr. Trailblazer Award, um, several other teaching and leadership awards in Spartanburg School District 7, and also served as a presenter at numerous national conferences. Marquis taught second grade at Cleveland Academy of Leadership for 4 years and was the assistant principal for 3 years. He is currently in his second year principal at Cleveland Academy of Leadership and is married to his high school sweetheart, Brenda, and they have 2 wonderful children together. At this time, I will turn it over to our guest presenter today, Mr. Marquis Clarke.
Thank you, Mr. Stutes. I appreciate that. Hearing some of those things makes me kind of wonder where that guy is, because here lately, my goodness, I took my mask off and I don't have a comb. I look really bad. I'm sorry, y'all. But here lately, being the principal of an elementary school during the pandemic just makes you feel just somewhat defeated sometimes. So I appreciate that warm introduction, Mr. Stutes. I'm so happy to see you all here today. Feel free to turn on your cameras, no judgment. You can see me right now. I'm looking in my worst form. My beard is kind of shabby and everything else doesn't look to be quite in place either. But I do want to kind of lay out some things. As Mr. Stutes said, I'm a real live principal. So I have my handy dandy walkie-talkie here. So if something happens and you hear some noise come over the walkie, I'll have to dismiss myself and handle that. Just point of reference, earlier today, I was actually in a Zoom meeting and I had 2 little fellows who allowed the pandemic to get the best of them. And unfortunately, they had some pent up frustration and they felt like they needed to handle that the old school way. So I had to leave the Zoom meeting, run out and break up a fight. But we got that taken care of. So I had to leave the meeting, unfortunately, but I think we'll be fine. But I wanted to put that out there just in case I had to abruptly leave the meeting. So hopefully you all have at least sort of did some quick reading or have done some thinking around our topic. And truth of the matter is, Mr. Stutes and I had kind of discussed this topic and thought it would be a good idea to bring this forward to have a conversation. I do want to say that this was well before what we witnessed on our nation's capital. So at some point in time during the presentation, we'll be talking about how all of this sort of intersects and how this impacts our work. So that we can create a level playing field, I'm going to begin with a video. The video is 5 minutes. And the video sort of provides a good context, a good foundation for us to sort of launch into our discussion.
My fellow Americans, we have endured a week such as no nation should live through, a time of violence and tragedy.
During the summer of 1967, after years of growing racial tension, Black neighborhoods in more than 150 cities erupted in protest, leading in some places to violent clashes with police and widespread destruction.
90 deaths, 2,000 injuries, 12,000 arrests.
In many cities, the unrest was sparked when Black communities protested against abuse by mostly white police departments. Often, police and the National Guard responded with more force.
Mass arrests that swept up many innocent bystanders along with the lawbreakers. In the conflict between white authority and Black ghetto, old grievances deepened and spread.
You cannot fight violent criminals with nonviolent methods. We had a war, and I think that you have to attack the war with warlike weapons and under warlike conditions.
What is responsible for this violence, for this rebellion, is the inability of the city government to feel, as human beings, the plights of the majority of the people in this city. And that is the cause of this violence.
As a result, President Lyndon Johnson formed a national commission led by Illinois Governor Otto Kerner to study why the uprisings happened and how they might be prevented in the future. The Kerner Commission's conclusions were stark. It pointed to decades of pent-up frustration in Black communities over police brutality, poverty, and the inequality caused by discrimination and segregation. And the Commission placed the blame for those inequalities squarely on white Americans and racism.
Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Discrimination and segregation have long permeated much of American life. They now threaten the future of every American.
The Kerner Report called for sweeping changes to American society, more economic opportunity in Black communities, better housing conditions, and more accountability for the police, including steps to stop police abuse, limit stop and frisk, and build trust between police and communities.
The Negro ghetto is a mystery to most police, except as a source of crime. But the Commission suggested that police start looking at it as a place where people live.
It warned that failing to act would lead to more division and more unrest. The findings captured the public's attention, but Johnson, despite his work on civil rights, ignored them.
A year after the Kerner Commission report on rioting in America, a private study warned today that the nation has drifted closer to a racially divided society.
20 years ago today, the United States was shocked by a report on racism in America. There have been changes in 20 years. Some things are worse.
Firestorm of uncontrolled riots and violence that is still going on tonight.
The same conditions that led to the riots of the 1960s also led to the violence and disorder in South Central Los Angeles.
Civil disorders and solutions to the causes of the violence were addressed nearly 25 years ago. The findings in the 400-page report could have been written yesterday.
Michael Brown's body is still in the middle of the street after that 18-year-old was shot by a police officer.
Well, in the wake of the violence in Ferguson, Missouri, President Obama is proposing sweeping changes to police departments nationwide.
We can't have Ferguson and Baltimore happening again and again.
An update to the Kerner Commission report says by many standards, the rifts in American society have grown worse. Child poverty is up. School segregation has returned to 1968 levels.
What do you want? I can breathe. Please, the name of it. I can breathe still.
So thank you all for hanging in and watching that video. I know sometimes videos can be hard to watch, especially when the content is sometimes thought-provoking, similarly emotionally provoking. So we saw some common things here. And one, we saw this timeline that naturally causes us to ponder and think around this idea that the more things change, the more they stay the same. We saw a common trend even from 1967 to just last summer, this ideal of rioting or protesting. And I think it'll be fitting if we began this discussion around the man who we are celebrating today and his work, and Dr. King. And Dr. King said, the riot is the language of the unheard people. And so the Kerner Commission, as you all saw in that video, sought to right some of the wrongs of America, some 100 years post the Civil War. I'll stop there and say that it is not as if America, as it relates to poor Black and brown minority, has never been responsive. I think it is fair to say that throughout the history of America, there's always been a group, large or small, that has called on our better nature to appeal to the humanity of Black people, right? I think that's even true if we talk about the significance of Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and how that novel had such a pull and an appeal on Northern whites that really got them energized and motivated around the abolitionist movement. One could also say the Freedmen's Bureau, as Congress, as a result of Abraham Lincoln being assassinated, writing and amending the Constitution, the 14th and the 15th Amendment, and the Freedmen's Bureaus being placed in the South and having the Union Army in the South. So there's always been an example in America where our conscience calls upon us to live in and operate in this ideal of a more perfect union. But in the same breath, and forgive me if I reference the Holy Book, you can't avoid it being a PK, a preacher's kid, can't avoid it. But in the same way, the book talks about this idea, the desire to do good, evil is always present. And so in the same way, that is also true in America's history. Whenever we seek to right the wrongs of our past around this idea of racism and racial justice, there's always been this notion of evil intention that for some reason, somehow always prevails. And so I guess for a good talking point for us today and a discussion topic would be, why is it that our good nature has not evolved? And why is it that our good nature has not surmounted the notion or the energy of evil, the lesser? Our theme is keeping the same energy. And what we saw in this video from 1967 to recently, it's just this summer, and one could even argue, while I would say perhaps not a good argument, just 2 weeks ago with the insurrection on the Capitol, this ideal of anger and frustration. Because I'm talking to a younger audience, I began using this correlation. I'm going to assume that you all are either mega fans or are familiar with Marvel Universe. And with Marvel Universe cinema, you've watched this sort of evolution of the Incredible Hulk, of Dr. Banner. And what we learned with Bruce Banner, the first time we were introduced to this character in Marvel Cinema Universe, Bruce Banner seemingly was always provoked to turn into the Incredible Hulk. And as Marvel Cinema became more sophisticated, it began to show this internal battle of Bruce Banner and the Incredible Hulk. But in the last series, something very special happened. We found ourselves, if you all remember, one of the last scenes of the Endgame, Bruce Banner shows up on his moped. And the Avengers are on their last leg. And they're getting invaded. And Bruce Banner shows up on his moped, and Captain America and Iron Man are looking at him like, we could really use you if you could just transform into the Hulk. But remember, anger requires the Hulk, requires Bruce to transform into Hulk. And so Bruce Banner in his human form begins to walk towards one of the approaching spaceships. And the Avengers said, hey, Bruce, you need to transform. If you're going to go attack these monsters, you need to transform. And Bruce then turns back to the Avengers and says, I've learned my secret. And he says, the secret is, I am always angry. And so I want to talk on this ideal of how is it that I can get the 17 participants in this group to be angry enough, to always be angry, and to do something that is worth doing to move this cause forward. So we have to keep this same energy if we're going to see the kind of change we want to see. And I would encourage you, as I am coexisting in this duality, this ideal of being a professional Black male as a principal, as an educator, but also being a worker towards civil rights, in that I see my work as a civil rights agent work. Give you some context, at the Cleveland Academy of Leadership, Cleveland is majority African-American school. We have a poverty index of 98%, so much ability in our students. But oftentimes, we don't expect greatness out of our students, and whether that be from community partnerships, whether it be from parents, whether it be from teachers, I've come to the conclusion that it's all of our faults that we have a school like Cleveland here in Spartanburg, South Carolina, on the north side of the city of Spartanburg, that has now gone 22 years without having a passing report card. And so I've come to the conclusion that as it relates to education, my field of expertise, I don't have enough people who are angry around getting more equitable results for our Black and brown children, particularly those students who are less fortunate. You heard early in the video that we are in this place in America, as it had warned in the Kerner Commission, that we are in a more separate and a more unequal society. So my question to the group would be, thinking about, as you all begin your path of adulthood, real adulthood, where you have real responsibilities, a real career, and a real job, after post-college is what I'm talking about. How can you all get involved in work that infuriates you so much that you want to see a more equitable solution? Toward the end of Dr. King's life, as he retreated just on the islands of South Carolina, he had said and had written that he had feared that he had rushed his people into a burning house. So towards the end of Dr. King's life, he had realized that this evil around racism and economic mobility and injustice was perhaps more than the work of one man, more than the work of his lifetime, in that as he has always known, he would need allies. So getting back to the Kerner Commission, why is it that we have ignored the path set forth by this 400-page document? And I struggled and toiled with why we've gotten there. And as a Southern Black male who has been conditioned as a Southern Black male, I am now aware of how I have been conditioned as a Southern Black male. Initially, I would have argued that this is simply a matter of racism. I've struggled with that thought, and I think I'm in a new place in that I'm not so sure that it's just racism. I think we're at a place where, and I'm going to reference the Kerner Commission, I think we're at a place where it really is contingent on who shares the narrative and who's telling the story. And so as I seek to engage more intentionally with people who vote differently than I do, who think differently than I do, who love differently than I do, who may even in some cases speak differently than I do, I've come to realize that racism really isn't the thing that folks are voting on or voting against. It's really about the story that's being told. I'll point to the Kerner Commission. As they were getting ready to release this document, there were conversations among the committee members about how do we present this to the American people. So you had two thoughts. One thought was we should be very careful of how we deliver this commission, this report to the American people, because we don't want white folks to feel guilty or bad about the injustice of Blacks. And they toyed on that. They really did. They toyed on how is it that we're going to get this message out to people. Finally, Otto Kerner said, we have to tell the people the truth. And so when they presented the plan, the commission in the recommendation, they laid it out blatantly that this was a matter of poverty and racism. And if we can somehow surmount this challenge by understanding each other's story, then we will get to a place where there is some commonality where we can advance each other forward. The death of the Kerner Commission, the death of the work of the Freedmen's Bureau, all have the same underlining, and that is who's telling the story and how is it that we invoke or provoke rather white fear amongst the white community in order to pull away from this agenda of things being more equal. President Johnson was convinced through and through that in the same way the riots were the work of one organization, you may hear it now in mainstream media as Antifa. Antifa got a whole lot of credit for a whole lot that it didn't do. But it's this idea that maybe an organization is provoking people. The same is true if you have studied history, this idea of the carpetbaggers and people from up north, they call northern aggressors, coming down south to provoke Blacks or to provoke whites to cause a unsettle or disequilibrium in Southern happiness or Southern utopia. It's this idea that surely folks are seeing it the way that I see it. I want to stay on this idea of who's sharing the narrative because it's so powerful. If you look around the South, particularly in South Carolina, if you look around Spartanburg, you rarely ever see a Union memorial or a Union monument. Although the Union won the Civil War back in the 1800s, in the South, that's not a reality. That's not the narrative that is shared. And it's not the narrative that is shared because there's this different story that one seeks to tell that is different from reality. And as long as we allow people, which this would be a thought that I want to share, the nugget or the jewel that I want to share, as long as we allow people to tell our stories for us, and as long as we allow others to tell other story, we will never advance this American society the way we ought to. I encourage you all to perhaps turn off the television, walk across the dorm, change your, if I would imagine Wofford's cafeteria is very similar to high school and colleges cafeterias all over the country where folks sort of have a table that they assign themselves to. I just wonder if there are folks in this group who are willing to sort of abandon their own ideas of what they believe might be right or true and just go reach out and establish a relationship, begin a conversation with someone. So that way we can begin causing this sense of cognitive dissonance in that the garbage and minutia that we're being fed, if our reality is different than the garbage and minutia that we're being fed, then we can begin to really have some intellectual thought and intellectual conversation around, well, what is it that I believe to be true? So, Mr. Stooks, I'll stop there. My idea here was to engage in conversations. And I would certainly love for folks to chime in, ask questions, share thoughts so that we can take this topic deeper.
Thank you for that, Mr. Clark. I think what we can do that. We're going to change the format up a little bit, which is not a problem at all. I'm going to give the acknowledgments for the committee, and then I'm going to stop recording, And then that way, once we start recording, everybody can turn their video on and we can engage in conversation from that point. Is that sounds good?
Sounds good.
Okay. So in my acknowledgements, I said, I just want to use this time to uplift my colleagues on the Wofford College 2021 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Committee for their efforts in this year's celebrations. So those folks would include Dean Taifa Alexander, Ian Brown, Brianna Dogan, Park Faison, Angela Filler, Isaiah Franco, Dr. Boyce Lawton, Marshall McDill, De'Aaron McGowan, Sarah Milani, Olivia Miller, Kia Kaiser, Tatasia Robinson, Lee Smith, Dr. Tasha Smith-Tyus, Jesselyn Story, and Toria Teemer. Also want to extend a special thank you to the Office of the Provost for its support as well.